very good evening and welcome. It is time once again for CU Immigration here on WRFU LP Urbana 104.5 FM. I will be your host for this evening. My name is Mr. Garza, and I'm here to let you know that WRFU is an open forum for the Urbana-Champaign community. Views expressed are those of the speakers and are not intended to represent WRFU, UCIMC, Urbana Socialist Forum, or, as we like to say on the televised version of this show, UPTV. These views are our own, and by our, in this instance, I mean myself. Me, myself, and I. And, of course, anyone whose opinion may creep into some story that I perhaps will read to you during the course of the show. So lots of views, lots of opinions, lots of attitudes, lots of preconceived notions, biases perhaps, but not those of the aforementioned entities. They are absolved from anything that I say because I just said that disclaimer right there. Isn't it amazing, the magic of the law? All I have to do is say those few words, and then legally, all these entities are completely absolved. They all walk away breathing a heavy sigh of relief, going, we can't be held accountable for that guy and his views again. But, you know, that's how it works here. The law is a kind of a shifting sort of thing. It's made up to represent the interests of the people who have the sway, shall I put it that way? The power, the ability to get the laws passed. And that's who the laws operate on behalf of, I guess you might say. So because somebody was sued somewhere, someone got in trouble, now everyone has to make this little disclaimer on everything. You see them on DVDs and videos and things like that, like the thoughts expressed in the following commentaries do not reflect the opinions of blah, blah, blah. You know, it's all to deflect blame in case of blame. So if you blame anybody, blame me, myself, and I. So on with the blaming, or naming and shaming, whatnot, whatever it is that I do here. Well, I don't know what I do here. It's interesting. I came in here with absolutely no idea what I was going to talk about because this is a show about immigration, obviously. CU Immigration Forum. Boy, let me try that again. CU Immigration Forum is the group that I represent, although they probably want to be added to the disclaimer as well because, you know, they could be sued too. But anyway, they haven't mentioned that to me, and I have not brought the idea up. But be that as it may, I represent CU Immigration Forum. This show is CU Immigration without the forum because there's no forum here. It's just me or the occasional guest as well. And so it's, you know, it's a show about immigration. I talk about immigration, immigrant rights, the humanity of immigrants, the fact that these are people we're talking about and not just some nameless thing, nameless menace looming over the horizon, over the border, so to speak. It's, you know, it's actual people with lives and families and you know, they do things and they go places and they buy stuff and they sell stuff and they work, and they are basically just like everybody else in the community except that they were born somewhere else. That's why they're immigrants. They came here from somewhere else, some other country. But, you know, as I've said so often on this show, it's not really particularly different if somebody comes here from, say, Idaho or Florida or California. I mean, if you think of Europe, for example, to go from one country to another in Europe is about the same distance as going from one state or another here in the U.S. That's how big a place this is. And yet there's some nebulous, I don't know, imagination of unity based around the people that live in these United States as somehow having some shared quality to them that makes these different states, these different places, somehow part of everyone's patrimony, so to speak, as opposed to someone who comes from over the border somewhere. Suddenly it's like, oh, this is not their place. They don't belong here. We need to be very careful about who we let in and what they're up to. And, it's just complete nonsense. I mean, it's really complete nonsense to create this sense of us and themness to the question. And I try to get at this point in different ways in different episodes because it really matters how you think about this issue. The notion that the differences in people from other countries are great enough that they are somehow threatening to your way of life is really strange if you think about it. I've traveled all over the U.S. over the years in my work, and there are some pretty huge differences between people in different states. Maybe not so much now as when in my traveling days, because that was some time ago in the 80s and 70s. I was traveling around a lot around the country. And in the time since then, television, magazines, newspapers, movies, all those things have spread sameness, I guess, if I can put it that way, around the country, even around the world in some ways, but certainly around the U.S., a sort of a sameness of style and yearning for similar kinds of expressions of identity, I guess. So you'll see the same fashions from place to place, state to state across the country. You'll hear the same language generally, although I can say there are some places in the U.S. where people speaking their version of the English language are pretty hard to understand at times if they're not being very clear and precise about how they articulate their words. It can be a bit of a trick to understand them. And it's interesting, if you think of a country the size of the UK, for example, there are accents that are remarkably different from each other just a few miles apart, what we would think of as just the different parts of the state. So if you take somebody from northern Illinois, somebody from Chicago, or even Waukegan, I guess. Is that in Illinois? I don't know. Anyway, northern Illinois, and you bring them together with somebody from southern Illinois, there's going to be a difference in the way they speak, but it is not such a great difference. It's like, yeah, they'll have a conversation. They might have a few local slang terms that are different, but basically they'll be able to have a conversation. But in the UK, you've got like Cockney, and you've got Welsh accents, and you've got Southern accents, and I mean they're really pretty striking in how different they are. And a lot of them are so different that I know when I hear native speak, not broadcaster types who are speaking like this, as we do, those of us in the business, I make a joke of that, but I mean, I speak in a way that is different from, your neighbor, probably. Being on the radio or on television or doing the kinds of things that I've done over the years, I have schooled myself to be more clear about how I speak, how I put things together. I'm sure there are lots of times when you're listening to me and you're going, what the heck is he talking about? I go off on tangents. I get lost a lot, but you can understand my words anyway. I speak clearly, and I make it a point to enunciate. in ways that, most people don't. So the guy that lives next door or the woman down the street or whatever, they're often varying degrees of intelligibility, if I can put it that way, because that's not their business to be understood. I personally would think that it behooves everyone to pay attention to how they sound and to try to make themselves as understandable as possible, because communication, there's no point in even opening your mouth if you're not going to make what comes out of it something that the person listening can understand. Why bother? Just nod and grunt a lot and go, yeah. You can go through life like that if you don't really care that anybody understands what you say. But, for some reason, there are a lot of people that just don't worry about it. It's like your problem. You figure it out. I'm talking. You figure out what I'm saying. You deal with it. So that's a tangent for sure. But my point being that in this country, basically, as much as I've traveled around and as many different accents and sort of regional cultural differences you might say there are, there are places you can go where people are generally politer and much more socially respectful, and places where people just act like, I don't care, and don't even look at you or respond or answer you if you talk to them. There are differences like that between the people in New York are going to be very different from the people in Athens, Georgia, for example, if you go to those places. But they're not remarkably different. And yet, that might as well be two different countries, at least from a European perspective, in terms of the distance between the two places. It certainly would be two different countries. And in Europe, they would have two different languages, and they would have these long cultural histories. But, when you think about it in those terms, in the terms of like actual distance between people and things like that, it's not a huge difference. What am I trying to say? It's not a huge difference in terms of distance between someone in Italy and France, for example, and the distance between someone in New York and Florida, or let me go, New York and Texas. There's not that huge a difference, except that here everyone's in the same country, even though there's this vast landscape in between them, and they're in two separate countries. And they're. I keep saying that, don't I? That's one reason why they created the European Union, was because they recognized, all right, we've got all these little smallish countries clumped together. We have a lot of shared interests. We have, a shared sense of where we are and what we need and where we're going and what we're trying to do, and we should be working together. Because we have places like the U.S. that is, as I'm saying, as big as all of us put together, and they're competing with us as a single entity, and we are each trying to compete as little tiny entities. What was that? I was reading the other day that the state of California has like the world's fifth largest economy. So if California were its own country, it would be one of the top, economic countries in the world. And yet it's part of the United States. So I guess my point, I'm rambling here in a very drastically disorganized way, but my point is just that we treat somehow the difference between borders here as something much larger than it ought to be, that we ought to be thinking about it. We're sort of shocked by the fact that people coming, say, from the southern border up, they speak different languages. They have different customs, It's like, ooh, that's shocking. That because we live in this giant space that you can drive around for days on end and never see anything but the United States. I mean, you can go in any direction from here anyway, in Illinois, and just drive for hours and hours and hours and days and still be in the U.S., and still be around people that speak English, more or less, and you still have recognizable currency and, customs and things like that. So that's part of the reason, I think, why it seems to be easy to get people here riled up about this notion of immigrants as being somehow threatening to our way of life, to our, the fabric of our society is being disrupted by these people coming from elsewhere, because their difference, the fact that there is a difference between some of them and us, makes them seem somehow outlandish and strange and frightening and alien to us. But if we put on a more mature hat, if I can call it that, and changed our attitude and thought in a more mature global way, we are citizens of the world. We all live on this world together. It's an odd notion. And an alien from another galaxy coming here would probably find it a very odd notion that we here on Earth separate each other so much based around these trivial differences in location or in language, when they're going, well, you're all together on this same globe, so you're all Earthlings. You're all Earthlings, every one of you. And you all look the same to me. I can't tell you apart because I've got 3 eyes and 4 legs and things like that. Their notion of us would be that we're all the same. We're all basically the same. And yet our notion of us is that we're all completely different. And it's so different that, those people from over there can't possibly come here. We can't allow them to come here because they're so strange and so different. So it's really, it's an odd thing. And that's something that I've grappled with. I mean, I'm talking about this mainly because it is a struggle that I have on the show to try to figure out how to get that point across. And I feel like in the last few minutes in talking about this that I did myself a disservice by just making it more confusing than it needs to be. But it really isn't that confusing a point. It's just hard to figure out a new way of saying it so that someone will go, oh, yeah, okay, I get it. I mean, that's really all I'm trying to do here, is just figure out some new way of saying, they aren't that different from us, and we shouldn't be that afraid of them or what they bring to us. And in fact, they're bringing stuff we can use and that we need. Economically, immigrants add to our economy in a huge way. As far as ideas and innovation and energy and all sorts of things, they bring all that kind of thing with them. Yes, there are different kinds of immigrants. There are people that are bright and go-getters who come in and they're, going to make the world a better place. And there are people who are like, yeah, whatever, I'm looking for a free ride. And everything in between. So it's not, you can find examples of anything you want. If you're trying to make a point, you can find someone that makes your point for you. But the greater point, if you stand back from that sort of gamesmanship, I guess you might call it, and just look at the bigger picture is that immigrants are people, citizens who live in this country, native to this country, are people. There are all sorts of different kinds of people living here. There are all sorts of different kinds of people who want to come here for various reasons. So yeah, there needs to be some sort of system for judging the appropriateness of someone's desire to come here, because there are people certainly in the world who would come here and cause trouble if they could. Now, why that is a different question. And there are a lot of things we could do about that if we weren't so arrogant and didn't have such a sense of I'm not even sure what the word would be, the sense that we can do whatever we want and no one should be able to do anything back to us. We've got this sort of U.S. as the policemen of the world, as the people who get to say what is and is not good behavior, integrity. We imagine ourselves in all sorts of strange ways here in this country in terms of like picturing our greatness or our, you hear the question, American exceptionalism, like, oh, this person is bad because he doesn't believe in American exceptionalism. Well, what does that even mean? What is American exceptionalism? What makes us exceptional? Well, we're really big country. So is Russia. So is China. So there are some other big countries out there. We're not the only big one. We're an economic powerhouse in some ways, but certainly not the way we used to be. And China is a pretty stiff competitor at this time. And there are some countries that are far smaller than we are, with fewer natural resources that give us a run for our money. So there's nothing particularly exceptional about us, except that we're so big that we can kind of throw our weight around. We spend the most money of anybody in the world on our military, so we are a scary and dangerous group in that sense. So that's kind of exceptional that a country would waste so much money on its military and still think that more should be spent. That's kind of frightening if you think about that, but that's nothing to like necessarily be proud of. It's sort of creepy if you think about it. But it kind of goes with the whole idea that, hey, everybody should have a gun and should be shooting people that they think are threatening, and that all that nonsense that you hear from people. So anyway, yeah, I'm going on and on and on, and I'm not really making much of a point here. Just my point was to that whole long meandering segment was just that we really need to step back and think differently about what constitutes the us and the them of the world. Like, what makes somebody a them and why? Because we should be embracing each other and learning from each other and growing from the new ways of looking at things and doing things that we can share with one another, not hiding in our respective closets and being afraid that somebody might come up with a different idea or say something that seems strange, or even dress in a different way or speak in a different way than we do. I don't know. So that's the struggle of this show. That's one of the things that I struggle with week after week. And I know I hear you scoffing when I say that, like, well, where were you last week and the week before that? Well, I have a life and I do stuff, and I just can't always get in here to do this show, and it takes a lot of energy to sit here and talk for an hour straight about a topic, whatever that topic is. There's only so much to be said, and I try to say it, but sometimes life gets in the way, and I have other things to do, so I don't always come in here. But be that as it may, it's still, that is my point when I do come in here, and I appreciate you listening when you do listen. Is I'm trying to humanize this topic because it is so often treated as something, I don't know, something frightening and strange and serious. I mean, it's serious because there are people involved, and there are people who are hurting people, people on our side, believe it or not, who are hurting people, who are people who claim to be on our side, who are hurting people on our behalf. And so it's serious in that sense. But if people didn't turn it into such a serious thing, if they didn't treat it as such a big deal, it really wouldn't be. It would be almost no problem at all. It would be only occasionally difficulty in times of great stress. I know some of the countries around in the Middle East are having huge problems because of, like, the war in Syria, for example. I was reading last night that, like, millions of people have left the country seeking refuge in other places. So the countries around Syria have had to absorb a huge number of people coming in looking for a place to stay. Just like, I can't stay there anymore. I have to come here. That's really hard when you're a small place or you don't have a lot of infrastructure or a lot of money, as many of those countries are in that situation. It's very difficult for them to absorb these masses of refugees coming from across the border. So yeah, immigration can be a problem, but that's not the situation here. We have not had that. It is nothing like that. The problems that we have are those that we create ourselves. For example, when the unaccompanied minors started coming in, there was a couple of times these surges in the unaccompanied minors coming up here that created a big problem for us because we felt this need to do something about them. So they come in and, like, well, you can't just come in and wander around. We have to deal with you in some way. So we have to find a place for you to stay while we find somebody for you to stay with, blah, blah, blah. We created that problem ourselves. If we had just said, okay, there's lots of you coming in, welcome, go where you're going to go, do what you're going to do, and you're on your own, then they would have come. They would have gone to wherever they were going, and, not one in a 1,000, not one in a million people in this country would have even noticed that it was going on. But because we were trying to go, whoa, wait, get in line. We're going to talk to each one of you. We're going to figure out what the deal is. Then it was a problem because there were so many of them. So, when you look at these problems and you think about the difficulties that arise from immigration, most of them come from the fact that we feel the need to do something about or something to everybody that's coming here from somewhere. We have to talk to them. We have to see their paperwork. We have to do all these different things. And so when they come in and they circumvent any part of that process, then, oh no, the process is all messed up. You're making it more difficult. You're creating difficulties and problems, and oh no, we have this big problem with immigration. But the problem is ours. It is of our making in most instances. So I'm going to read a few articles here because I'm just blabbing about stuff and I'm not really making any great points here. But keep that in mind when you hear this. Keep what I was talking about in mind about who's creating the problems, and then on this next article, and you'll kind of get a different sense of how it sounds when I read it. So this is entitled, Sessions Criticizes Immigrants' Attorneys Before Immigration Judges. So Attorney General Jeff Sessions told a new group of immigration judges Monday that it is their job to, quote, restore the rule of law, end quote, to the immigration system over the contrary efforts of the lawyers who represent immigrants. Think about that for a second. The remarks at the training of the largest ever class of new immigration judges implied that the judges were on the same team as the Trump administration and that immigrants and their attorneys were trying to undermine their efforts.